and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I am Nosiba Southern, and I'm a member of the CMC's Board of Trustees, and I am delighted to see you here today. Now, CMC is pleased to present today's forum, Women's Suffrage in 100 Years of the 19th Amendment, sponsored by Otterbein University, and brought to you in partnership with the League of Women Voters of Metropolitan Columbus and the Ohio History Connection. Each of our sponsors and partners are represented here by many friends and associates, and so won't you please help me thank them. Now please welcome Wendy Sherman Heckler, Provost and Senior Vice President of Otterbein University, to introduce our forum and today's speakers. Wendy.
Thank you, Nosiba. And thank you, Columbus Metropolitan Club. Otterbein University is proud to support the CMC as we convene weekly town hall meetings on important community topics. When it comes to changing the rules to advance the public good, Otterbein University has always sought to have the foresight to do the right thing. In case you didn't know, Otterbein is counted among the very first universities in the United States to grant women equal access to academic programs. We opened with both men and women on our faculty and in our classrooms. Furthermore, Otterbein's first two graduates were women, Sarah Miller and Mary Catherine Winter. And to be clear, these aren't Otterbein's first two women graduates, but our first graduates, period. Today, we aim to continue this legacy via programs like the Women's Leadership First Year Seminar that I teach every fall, and the Women's Leadership Network, representatives of which are in the audience today at the Otterbein table and scattered around the room with the organizations and groups that they represent and advance. I want to personally thank these individuals for their passion for and commitment to advancing women's issues. We can also take heart in our state's commitment to this cause. Did you know the Ohio Women's Convention held in 1850 was the first women's rights convention held outside of New York State? Some 500 people, including many anti-slavery activists, attended. You may know of Sojourner Truth's impassioned speech about Black women and equality given 1 year later at the state meeting in Akron, Ohio. In her foundational book, Women, Race, and Class, Angela Davis reminds us that Truth's "Ain't I a Woman" speech established a militant fighting spirit among those mid-19th century activists. And to be a Whig historian for just a moment, Truth reminds us of the relevance of intersectionality in the search for equality. It would take many more years for their efforts to be realized in the Constitution, but on June 16, 1919, Ohio voted to ratify the 19th Amendment. Ohio also, at that time, passed legislation ensuring women would be able to vote in the presidential election of 1920 in case the amendment was yet to be in effect nationally at that time. So, over a century ago, Otterbein and the state of Ohio were not afraid to do what is right. As we contemplate the glass ceilings yet to be smashed, let us hope that our courage and our innovative, inclusive spirit will help pave the way for more remarkable women and girls. This afternoon, I'm excited, as I know you are, to discuss the past, present, and future of women's equality. So let's get to it. Please join me in welcoming our speakers today. Director of the Cultural Resources Division at the Ohio History Connection, Megan Wood. Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Ohio, Jen Miller. Associate Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at The Ohio State University, Treva Lindsay. and our moderator, the executive producer and host of All Sides with Ann Fisher at WOSU Public Media, Ann Fisher. Ann, the stage is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. Over the weekend, I took a long trip up to the Upper Peninsula in Michigan, and I got to read The Testaments by Margaret Atwood, sequel to The Handmaid's Tale, if you don't know. And I wondered off and on how Atwood captured the tone of that stratified and totalitarian society in which women in particular were so thoroughly diminished. And then I dived into the history of women's suffrage movement in the United States and found exactly what I was looking for, although I'm certainly not trying to put words in Margaret Atwood's mouth. But in the arguments I found from men and many women just 100 years ago that the female gender was incapable of the monumental task of voting. And of course the task is indeed monumental. Just ask the League of Women Voters or almost anybody. And women, of course, are up to the related challenges, but women remain far outnumbered in many state legislatures, including the Ohio General Assembly and, of course, in Congress, especially the U.S. Senate. And still the debate rages over whether a woman can get elected president in the United States in between discourse over her facial regimen. So I'm wondering, how is the gender gap in elective office in this country reflective or not of the battle for voting rights? And, Trevo, why don't we kick it off with you?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So that's a pretty dense question to kind of unpack and think about in the context of history. But what I will say is that looking at this long history of voting rights activism, and in suffrage, we're celebrating 100 years for women, which still didn't apply to most non-white women in this context, which is important to think about, that not all women are part of that conversation, that voting rights, by and large, is a struggle that really admits groups of people at different times across time. So in 1924, we have the right to vote for Native Americans regardless of their citizenship status. 1943 is when we have Chinese immigrants are finally granted citizenship and voting rights. It's not until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act that African Americans actually fully enfranchised in practice. 1971 is when we lower the age to 18. As opposed to 21, and it's not actually until 1986 that we have what we consider provisional and absentee ballots. And so if you look at that history in that context, we're always thinking about how do we make these rights more inclusive? How do we push towards that? And that this fight really begins in the early 19th century, and we're just arriving at this more full inclusivity in 1986 suggests that we have a long way to go. And that's just on the voting side. When we think about electoral politics and who is running for office and who's getting elected to office, that has a much slower history, unfortunately. There's not a legislation that requires us to vote for women. And so I think some of that work in organizing is mirrored in terms of the rough road that was traveled by suffragists and voting rights activists across over a century of activism, and that we have to continue that kind of push with regards to people running for electoral positions.
Historically, back in the day, did they think, Megan, that, next thing you know, there's going to be a woman president?
I think there were some that hoped. People like Lucy Stone went right to working for the Equal Rights Amendment, which, if you're watching the news, what's happening in Virginia, and people getting excited about that. So that'd be a great thing to do in the 100th year. But women in Ohio were able to run for school board in 1894 and vote in school board elections, and because that was seen as the proper role for women to be influencing school. It's more closely related to family. And we were discussing this with the County Commissioners Association of Ohio. Jen was at that meeting and talking about the early enfranchisement around school board elections. And there were many women who then entered the the fold then. And one of the county commissioners said that, and I believe she's the first woman county commissioner in her county, that she was told when she went to run for office, well, maybe you should start with school board. So a lot of these arguments, are very similar. So I think there were definitely those who were hopeful and who were moving right on to the next thing, and you see that with the League's history, but probably weren't entirely surprised. Well, they'd probably be surprised if they were here now that we haven't had a woman president yet, but in 1920, probably not.
Well, so much of the infrastructure of the system still was run by white males. I mean, Jen, right?
Yeah, actually, so the League of Women Voters was formerly the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association, and we were the ones working to get women the right to vote. Our first victory was in, I think it actually was 1895, but in the 1890s to allow women to vote for school board. And then we failed multiple times to bring that to the ballot. We did bring it to the ballot. We kept failing in bringing suffrage to women of Ohio. But I'll say this, once we knew the 19th Amendment was going to pass, there was a movement across the country to form the League of Women Voters of Ohio. So the Ohio League turns 100 in May. The U.S. League turns 100 on Valentine's Day. And the idea really was this. You could be in a household where a man, the voter in the household didn't even think you should vote or could vote. So do you want that to be the person that teaches you the mechanics, tells you where and how? And so initially it was, this is the finishing task. We must empower this new enfranchised. We must, these new enfranchised folks. And so for 100 years is what we've been doing. Our number one priority remains educating voters. And Ohio's legacy for the League is actually really significant. Most of you probably know us for our nonpartisan voter guide. We're known for that nationally. That started in Ohio. Most of you may know us for our nonpartisan status. That was really championed by Florence Allen, who was of the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association, and then of and Belle Sherwin, and then of the League of Women Voters, and then Florence, of course, became the first elected judge. So absolutely, we have to think about what was happening in that time frame.
Wendy Sherman-Heckler mentioned the intersectionality of all of this, and that is true in so many movements, and yet through history, for a long time at least, we're often taught just one version of the story. And it wasn't, as you noted, Treva, until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act that black women or any women of color were secured the right to vote in the U.S. And even then it was a risk in many places for a long, long time. But African-American women worked side by side with white women to get the vote in 1920. Things started to fall apart previous to that, and the women's suffrage movement for a long time was aligned with that. Furthermore, with the abolitionist movement, right? So where did those paths, because there's many paths, but where did they diverge? I mean, what's been, and then I want you guys to talk about what the long-term fallout has been of that divergence.
Another really intense question. So I'll start with saying, right, we don't understand suffrage history in this nation without the contributions of African-American women. And I think that's really important to say because many of the folks we come to know as suffragists and who are instrumental in pushing this forward, and I always say we didn't fail, our country failed to rise to itself, right? So these women were pushing and succeeding and pushing in this battle continuously, but many of them start in the abolitionist movement. And there are these connections that are made between abolitionists and suffrage movements. So although we talk about Seneca Falls in 1848 as this historic landmark moment for thinking about women's suffrage, I actually tend to think back to the Anti-Slavery Convention in 1837, where you have the conversation around women's right to vote also in that conversation as well. And so you have this synergy, and it's fraught at different times because racism is real. And we're talking about at a time where we have enslaved people that are slaves of African descent. So there are still tensions that exist there, but there's still really incredible cooperative work that's happening interracially between white women suffragists, African-American women suffragists, some black men suffragists, as well as white men suffragists, right? There is this interracial cooperation, but when we get to the post-Civil War moment and we get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, and the battles that went on regarding what that would mean, the 14th Amendment defining citizenship in a particular kind of way, and the 15th Amendment, which in effect barred discrimination from the right to vote based on race, color, or creed, but did not specifically indicate sex or gender. And there were those who were adamantly opposed to supporting the 15th Amendment, any amendment that wouldn't allow women to vote but would only produce a class in which black men were able to vote. And you had those who were like, we should still support it and continue to do this work. And so that fracture and that split in the movement has long-term reverberations that I still think impacts women's movements and women's organizing to today. I would say there's distrust that is sowed in there. There's a sense that that cooperation is fragile and only in service of particular voices being elevated and being given rights. And so you see separate organizations form. You see some people like a Lucy Stone who continues to doing that work and is working with and in conjunction with African American suffragists through this passage of the 19th Amendment. And then when you have the 19th Amendment, there's still black women like, hey, we still don't have really the right in practice to vote. And there are suffragists who are like, but we won. This is a race issue now. And so those kinds of letdowns are really important to talk about why we say commemorate and not necessarily celebrate the 100th, because we want to acknowledge those tensions and want to acknowledge how race and racism and how sex and sexism play into this larger history.
And the Southern strategy that was openly used by suffragists was the idea of talking in Southern states to ratify the amendment, that it would enfranchise white women so there would be a larger block of white votes against the African American vote. And that was a very open, so it's using racism as a leverage to get the right to vote for women. And this wasn't a secret thing. This was pretty well known. So I think it's really important to understand that as well. And that word commemoration is really important.
And that split was certainly here in Ohio. So at one moment, both the National Women's Suffrage Association and the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association were based in Ohio, and they had a disagreement on race, where the National Women's Suffrage Association really was far more segregated and really did not tackle race at all and was not inclusive at all. I certainly wouldn't say the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association was perfect in that matter, but we see throughout the entire movement a disagreement on how to handle work for both race and gender justice. And let me just say this. What we take from this today matters most. We don't want to whitewash this history, and we don't want to just beat ourselves up about it. Right? I think it's important to look at the humanity of the situation. If you had been someone working against slavery and the right to vote as a woman, and the 15th Amendment comes up, where does that put you? It's not an easy decision. It's easy for us now in our 21st century. That doesn't mean I'm making an excuse, but I am saying that we have to not rob these early leaders of their humanity. And we have to remember that we have opportunities every day to rise above very similar challenges. And I challenge all of us to do that. I challenge all of us to make sure, whatever organization you're in, that you are hearing from many voices. I challenge you to make sure that people don't all look like you around the table. I challenge all of us to make sure that we seek out opinions, whether it's a political party, whether it's different expertise, as in Treva and I have very different studies, different backgrounds, and of course she's got her doctorate and I don't, so let's give her props for that. I think this is where we go, right? We say, okay, we messed some stuff up there. It makes sense because humans are human and we're human, right? And when we all get together, it gets messy. But we can work together, and we can do a better job being more intersectional, and that's what I hope we get out of this more than anything else.
Seems like so often, I mean, we were talking about the lexicon earlier. It's not suffragette, it's suffragist. And we were wondering out loud, where did the suffragette thing come from and why did people get so confused? And it's from Mary Poppins. Okay. I mean, everybody knows that's what they called them, and I don't quite understand why it's a derisive term, but be that as it may, that's how I even learned. It was watching Mary Poppins when I said to my mom, "What's a suffragette?" And she said, "Well, they're just fighting for the women's vote." Well, why? Meaning, don't they already have it? Well, how ridiculous. And I was, in second grade. I probably was younger, but I don't know. And I don't know. I don't know if I'm dating myself, but what about that and how we're teaching it? It's not enough if you're growing up not knowing that there was no woman's vote until 100 years ago at all in the United States. So, Megan, what about that? Is there enough yet?
Probably not. I don't know how many of you had the kind of textbook in school like me where there was like a little lady in the corner who did something, or maybe you read like a special book, and that has been, And they may or may not have been real women. They may have been fictional. I remember this story of a woman carrying water in the battle in Civil War. Like, who knows why that's the one woman that I was learning about in the Civil War. But I think it's where representation and a woven narrative, I think getting back to the idea of intersectionality, a woven narrative of the human story, and sometimes we think it's too complex for kids to handle, and that, to teach it takes a lot of resources. So when we put together, you'll see the panels in the back here, I'll give ourselves a little pitch at the Ohio History Connection. We also pulled together some teachers that created curriculum to go along with it. And so even though I think we see in our role, and probably the league as well, that maybe the textbooks aren't going to do it, but what can other organizations do to provide enriching resources to teachers so that you can get it in school, but that also when they come to our places that they see different stories and narratives that are often much more interesting than just having a lady in the box in the corner. And so I think that's something that we're always trying to think about and always trying to do better, is bringing in multiple voices, and that we're talking about suffrage, but let's talk about what's happened since then. Let's talk about 100 years of change, and not just a tiny moment in time all by itself, but also that 100 years ago wasn't that long. My great-grandmother, who I knew, would not have been able to vote until she was 22 years old, because that's how old she was when the amendment was passed. So it's not that long ago. So it's also an inspiration to utilizing that right that people worked really hard for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is so important, and one of the reasons we did the guide that we did, a reading list, a guide, a discussion guide that we have to provide some additional resources. Because I'm trying to remember what I learned about suffrage, and it's probably pretty paltry in terms of the broader scope. And it's such an important thing. Voting rights in the context of the U.S. is so important. I wouldn't have known the difference between a suffragette and a suffragist, which, is there a chance, suffragettes are in Britain. It's actually very simple. It's a pretty easy one, right? I think kids can get that, right? But to also understand in a more global context that the fight for voting rights was not just in the U.S., that these ideas that women were incapable of voting, wouldn't have the intellectual capacity to do as such, was something that was shared across places. And I think that really brings in the conversation a broader perspective. And I think we're always trying to widen our perspective on the world and how we see things. And I think those resources become super important, and also to understand how challenging this was, and how challenging getting an amendment passed is, how challenging it is to really change the perspectives, attitudes of so many people to get to a point where you get something ratified, the kind of activism that requires. And I think that's an inspiring lesson for young people to understand the work that went in on how you organize, how you mobilize, what kinds of connections you make, to look at failed partnerships and learn from them, and to be critical of those moments when we look back and say, hey, they didn't get it right here's what went wrong. Let's do better about that. And I think students, we often underestimate our students and our young people. And they're really sharp. They're the ones who are like, so wait, there's never been a woman president? Right. Really? Ever? Right? And so, that for them is commonplace. So we have to do that labor of believing in them and supporting them and giving the resources for them to be the critical thinkers that they often show us that they are.
And something we are always really interested in is that a lot of times it'll seem like it's distant. Like that happened in New York, that happened in DC, and we like to be like, no, this was like, there were women who were your neighbors or would have been your neighbors who were doing this work. Very kind of whatever normal everyday people are that, and so also bringing forth those stories of someone who was from here or from, we have plenty of stories to tell all across Ohio, and mining those and surfacing them is another thing that we can do from the cultural sector, but I think also just to know that it did happen here. There were many women engaged in this fight.
I was just going to say Seneca Falls was definitely a little piece of my textbook,
Right.
corner
You had a
section.
corner
Pretty sure it was like
about
light pink
Seneca Falls.
background.
Yeah.
So a couple things. One is I think it's really important to help youth understand what was going on. And obviously you can only take a snapshot in time, but right before women got the right to vote, there wasn't state funding for education. Kids weren't required to go to school. Women couldn't own property. Women couldn't divorce. If they did divorce, they didn't have their children. They probably lost their children. It can go on and on and on. And so I think there's a way of telling about how critical it was for cholera. Cholera outbreak had just, there had been some in the teens in Ohio, and one of the first things women did after they got the right to vote was work for clean water. Of course they did, right? And so I think it's important to tell that part of the story, because then it helps them understand the transformative nature of going to the ballot box. And I think that's important. Because we don't want them to take it for granted, and that helps them understand all the things that have changed since women have had access to the ballot box, and people of many different backgrounds have finally earned their right to the ballot box, and we're still continuing to work to make sure they have access. I did want to mention, because Dr. Lindsay mentioned, we have a reading list and discussion guide, and when people are walking out, you can grab those. We have the room is full of League people, which I love. And if you ever use our voter guide, I also think you're a League person. I consider you mine. But they'll be passing those out. We have the reading lists are literally baby board books all the way to heavy duty history. And then the discussion guide is really trying to dig into how do we talk about suffrage in this intersectional way? How do we grapple with the challenge, like the opportunities and challenges of working for racial and gender justice at the same time. So please make sure you grab those, and those are funded by Ohio Humanities.
One of the things I learned, they always have those pages like the Women's History Project and stuff where they say 7 things you didn't know about, the women, the history of the women's vote, whatever. And one of the things I learned, it wasn't in the 7 things, but from reading, was that the first protesters at the White House, the first time anybody ever protested at the White House, which we take for granted now, they have the big barricades up and it's all a big deal now, it was for the vote, for the women's vote. Back in the day.
A wartime president, too.
Yeah. So I just thought that was pretty cool. But the National Archive, because we don't know that, or I didn't, and the National Archives on Saturday apologized and said it removed from display a 2017 photograph of the Women's March. It had altered to censor signs referencing women's anatomy and President Donald Trump's name. And that made me wonder if the National Archives has ever altered anything else. That question has been posed by a journalist, of course, and the response, I think, is still pending. I'm not sure. But be that as it may, where does the comfort with altering her story come from? Historically, where does somebody feel comfortable doing that? And isn't that part and parcel of why we're even talking about what we're being taught today?
Yeah, the National Archives probably feels some pressures from the federal government that others may not, but it doesn't excuse
it's
it.
National Archives.
Yeah. It doesn't excuse it. I was looking at the 3 women who worked on our exhibit in the back as you were saying that, because that goes beyond the ethics of our field is, and we at one point we have collected some stuff from the Women's March, and there was a flag that says "Don't tread on me," and it's in the shape of women's anatomy, and we put it up in the museum, and that because it was a piece that we collected, and some people did ask, oh, is that political? And I mean, everything's political. It just depends on which, where you fall in the spectrum, whether you perceive it as political, and so I think that we're also thinking about representing the present. But anyway, it is hard to, I think, though, also present a story that's completely without bias, because we're all humans interpreting the story, and it has bias. So I think there's that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think my job often as a historian is not this objectivity, which we claim that we can have, but it's more important for us to think about the meaningful past and what is meaningful about understanding a set of circumstances, a set of conditions, and a set of actors moving at a particular moment towards something. And my job as a historian is to tell that story, as complicated as it is, as nuanced as it is, to try, for me as a commitment, and this is what some feel are politicized commitments, to ensure that the voices we usually don't hear are presented in that story as well, to look at the silences in the archive not as silences but as telling of something. So who's not there, who's not represented, and how do I find them, and how do I bring them into the story to ensure that I'm getting the fullest scope I can get. And I'll still have stories that people will tell me, did you know? And I'm like, I didn't. And it's really exciting to know that there are a million things I don't know, a million moments in historical figures that we don't know, because we have a lot of names that we know in the context of suffrage, but we know there are thousands all over in different places who are doing this work, who are organizing meetings, who are cooking for the meetings, who are marching, who are providing safe places for people to convene that are important and instrumental in the story. And so I think that censoring of the various ways that people show up in historical moments will always skew the historical record towards something that's much more narrow. And an idea of freedom for me that I think is really important, that's tied to the idea of freedom, is the ability to see the fullness of something, even when it's something that calls us in or out. That's something that we feel indicted by, that we still have to accurately represent that because it means something in that moment and it means something to us now, or else we wouldn't be working to censor it.
We will be moving to audience questions in just a few minutes, so please step up to the microphone, right over there. Don't be shy. But I wanted to bring up one final thought. We did get questions in advance, and one of them asked why so few women vote, and I thought, we could kind of talk about that, because the fact is, women vote at a higher rate than men. I don't know if that's always been the case, but what do we know about how women vote and the rate at which they vote? Jen?
So it's been several decades that women have outvoted men, and so let's continue that.
Well done, you.
We want everyone to vote. We want everyone to do their homework. In my household, I'll tell you that my daughter knows that I don't care how she votes, but she better do it, right? So I think that women are really awakening to their power. I think women are really recognizing that we need to continue to protect this franchise, participate in this franchise, and get more women running in office, because, again, representation matters. But I also think we need to remember, especially in terms of the gap in leadership, when your textbooks only have the little lady in the corner, right? Or when you walk the State House lawn and you don't see a monument of one woman who was alive at one moment making history, that it's hard for women to imagine themselves in leadership roles or to imagine that their role is somehow in government. And clearly we know that it is. And so I think we all need to continue to challenge those institutions and how they represent. And it also wouldn't be okay with me if it was only a white suffragist that was up, right? That we really need to be challenging ourselves and our institutions to be telling a full story that empowers us and inspires us to participate.
So without further ado, we'll get to it. It is the Columbus Metropolitan Club's tradition to take audience questions, so please state your name and ask your question. Please avoid editorial comments, although isn't everything politics? And remember, questions end with a question mark, so let's get started. First question, please.
Hello, Renee Delane from Women Who Dare, and I'd like if each of you could respond to the question and give us some ideas how men could be better allies or sponsors to help us find the truth about our past, the present, and going into the future so we can all forge the future together, men and women together.
That's a great question. I think that, and I think this is actually true for white women as well, speaking as one, that when we have opportunities in places of authority or in places of leadership to bring others with us, to tell stories, to represent, that we are thoughtful in who we're bringing with us, or when can we step aside to let someone else have an opportunity? That's one of the things that I'm trying to always think about in our work.
I would echo that, and thinking about it in terms of not always just the question of am I making space, but am I taking up space too, to ask those questions simultaneously. And sometimes we find that folks don't even recognize it. Just stepping out and providing an opportunity for someone in a space that already exists helps to bring along other people at the table, that the table starts to look different. And that people be invested in saying, look, I've been privileged and I've been talking a whole lot, and I see myself a whole lot in different things. I wonder if there are other folks who need that. So there is some self-reflexivity that I always call on allies to do, to see how much space they're taking up, and then how can they use that to make space for others. It's a two-part kind of process.
And I'm going to go even a little more practical. So all of us women in the room have been in a situation where we're trying to talk and we're being talked over, right, by men. And I can now think back in my professional, especially my early professional years, that an older man would often make space and say, but you know what, Jen was trying to say something right now, and I'd really like to hear from her. So it might not even be that you're the one taking the space, but you have an ability to create that space for someone. I think that's really important. I also just would mention mentorship. One of the things we know about the leadership gap is sometimes it's that information and teaching is going from, not even on purpose, but it's just going from older male to younger male. What if older experienced rock star male said, actually, this young woman is so special, I'm gonna give the mentorship to her. And I think that's really important too.
Hi, my name's Dina. I work for the Ohio Environmental Council. I want to thank each of you for being here and talking about these important issues. Treva, you in particular, a lot of what you said really resonated with me. As I work in the environmental justice field a bit, or at least we're working to be more justice-oriented in the work that we're doing. I appreciate you raising racism as part of this conversation because it's so incredibly important to recognize the intersections of when we talk about these issues and white vote versus, or white rights and black rights and other diverse communities. So thank you so much for raising that in this space. I wanted to create a space for us to think about what voting rights looks like related to racism or just voting rights generally now and currently. You know, I work for an organization that while we work on environmental policy, we've started to take on democracy issues because we can't pass important environmental justice policy until our democratic system is representative of all. And so we're thinking about things like same-day voter registration or automatic voter registration and how important the census is. So I really thought it's important for you three or a combination of you to talk a little bit about those specific things.
Great. Thank you. That's a wonderful prompt for us to think about in terms of the importance of voting rights and how we talk about them in a large scope in 2020 20 now that we're in 2020, that we're in. Recently, a very clear example of this is in Florida. Most recently, where Florida voters in 2018 voted overwhelmingly to re-enfranchise a population of formerly incarcerated people there. And judge recently ruled, as in last week, that the recently re-enfranchised by voters would now have to pay fines, all of their fines and fees and everything before having the right to vote, which is a poll tax, no matter how you cut that. And we have an amendment against a poll tax, but we see these maneuvers being made. And so part of this is us being vigilant in terms of what are the solutions to this, but what is actually happening is that we see various kinds of moves at the state level quite often that restrict voting in some way or another. And I think it's important to look at those moments. One, when we emphasize the importance of voting, if it weren't so important, there wouldn't be so much work to restrict it, and to restrict it in particular kinds of ways if it weren't important, if it didn't make a significant impact on our communities. And so I think it is the duty of everyone who's working in rights, regardless of where that rights conversation is, whether that is thinking about health, whether that's thinking about the environment, whether that's thinking about criminal justice, that voting rights is an essential component of all of that, and that the franchise is something, the elective franchise is something we need to think about as an expansive and inclusive right, not a restrictive and privileging thing, which it's often talked about in terms of privileging folks, that you lost your privileges to do this versus a right to do this. It is the reason we say elective franchise. It's the reason it's the Voting Rights Act of 1965, not the Voting Privileges Act of 1965. That emphasis on rights is so important, and I think we have a commitment from a democratic imperative to be doing that kind of work, to work against policies, laws, initiatives, efforts at various levels that restrict that right.
So, and I just hope that CMC will do one on this topic completely. I just wrote a treat. I could have a treatise on this, but there's several things. First off, I think a lot of times in Ohio, it's not even necessarily that there's an attempt to restrict, but the fact that the table isn't diverse, that we don't recognize that we are inadvertently creating challenges for college students, people with disabilities, senior citizens, people of color. And I'll give you several examples. One of the first is that we know that polling locations are far more likely to move in low-income neighborhoods. So confusion is the enemy of turnout always, number one. Number two, you don't have a car, so you take the bus, now you have to try to get on another bus. You're trying to do this on your lunch hour, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, maybe I'm just not gonna vote. And a lot of times the people who are designing the systems, those aren't their lived experiences. So we need to make sure we're wise in having diverse groups. College kids in Ohio have a hard time voting. One of the things that happens is that if your mailbox is not the address of your dorm, that creates a significant amount of confusion. We have high levels of provisional ballots in Ohio. We are one of the highest in the country provisional ballots for issuing a provisional ballot, and then also very terrible rates on having those provisional ballots count. Some of that is a systematic problem of maybe not educating our poll workers as well as we could. So if you're concerned about that, one of the things you can do is become a poll worker, because we need them. So there's all these different ways, and that's actually our job, right? And that's, I mean, I feel like I won the lottery, because every day I get to go to work just trying to figure out how democracy can work better and be more participatory for more people. So another thing you can do, Dina, and Dina, of course, OAC is a great partner of the league, become a league member, and because we need you.
Hi, I'm Jaren Terry. I am volunteer president of PFLAG Columbus, which advocates, educates, and supports LGBTQ people and their families. So first, I want to say thank you, Anne, for bringing up the National Archives. I'll categorize that as shameful behavior. And I'm so glad to hear you talk about the voting rights amendment in connection with the suffragist success. But I wonder what lessons learned from the abolitionists and the suffragists working together might be applied to the passage of the Ohio Fairness Act, which, as you know, is in the Senate at this time, SB 11.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of what we've been talking about today is that the need for people who care about rights and access for all need to band together and look across, take a hand out across issues of identity, of whatever it may be, and that in working together to be more powerful, and that that the ultimate end goal is really about what Jen is talking about, everybody being able to have access to their rights and to fairness, and that's something that we should learn from history. And a lot of times we're asking people to think critically with history. It's not just about the dates and the facts, and that we should all be really think about it when something is restrictive, or when something comes up, to really think, well, do we have an example of this from the past? That's how I think. I'm asking those to be critical of these kind of things that come up related to IDs at ballot, anything that has sort of a smell of we've seen this before. So how can we learn from maybe the past splits in the movement to bring people together around issues of fairness and equality?
So I think that's totally true. I wanted to just mention a couple other things that I think are really important. In Ohio, one of the things that we sometimes see is that a transgender voter will go to the polls and their ID looks different than they are presenting, right? Their genders don't match. And sometimes they'll get treated badly by poll workers. And so that's another reason why, we actually work with many groups to send letters to all the boards of elections asking them to educate on that issue, because everyone should be able to vote. You don't have to look like the same gender. You just need to have the right name. There's an interesting thing happening right now in terms of the ERA, in that there is talk of now trying to bring up fears of LGBTQA communities as a reason to not really fully ratify the ERA. And so I think that's actually a real opportunity to try to be learning from the suffrage movement, in that we were weaker when we split, and just trying to take the higher ground and not taking the bait for hate.
Yes. Yes, I agree with all of this. I think the lessons from the past is that the fractures can be made really easily, so we have to be very attentive to that. And when it's being brought up that there's this model of a scarcity of something versus this expansion of something. And so, if they get that, you're not going to have that. And this pitting against one another, that is really dangerous, but it's strangely still very effective. And I think we have to rail against that, to think about an abundance approach to this, and what it means to commit to a context of rights in this forum through electoral processes that is open, that is full, and that is willing to consider that we got a lot of things wrong with this, and we can do better. And we are still getting things wrong, and there's so many opportunities for us to get it right. So I think we take those legacies in a really significant way.
Hi, my name is Dara Pizzuti, and I work with the Matriots, which is an organization that's nonpartisan, statewide, dedicated to getting more women elected throughout Ohio. And my question is, we're very keenly aware of the lack of parity in representation for women in elected office nationally, but also here in Ohio. And Megan, I was interested when you mentioned Lucy Stone, that the second that the 19th Amendment passed, she immediately started looking forward. And I guess my question is, 100 years later, the Matrix, we're trying to look at the horizon, and we're trying to determine what's next. What's the next battle, or where do you see us, going, and what would some of the suffragists of those days today be looking at?
One of the women that I think has come up already today, but that I like to mention, is Florence Allen, who was the first federal judge. She's from Ohio, from Cleveland, and she served on the U.S. Circuit Court here in Ohio She was appointed by Roosevelt into the 1950s, and she worked for suffrage. And in the 50s, she looked around and she, decided not to have a family. She devoted herself to this career and looked around and was kind of feeling like I thought there were going to be more women here with me by this point in the 50s. And so I think that there probably would be that feeling of that we haven't had a woman president yet. In Ohio, we haven't had an elected woman governor. I think that this issue of the pathways to office and to leadership that seem probably less transparent to women would be something that if suffragists were still here, they'd probably be working on actively. And I know there's probably many organizations that are here that are representing that. And we would love to make sure we're representing you in the future as we're working to collect that material. But I think that that's really, and obviously other reproductive rights and things like that, but the idea of who's at the table, that we fill the table that looks like America, that it doesn't right now.
I think the work of the Matriots is so important, and I saw Shadia, Ohio State's power, and of course we have the Women's Fund here. I think it's just absolutely important that we continue that work. I wanted to actually give a shout out to one of my superheroes, which is Mary Austin Palmer. Would you stand up, Mary? Mary, I know she doesn't want me to do this, but Mary, when I was a kid, we started environmentalism by teaching the kids recycling. Mary is going into all the schools that no longer teach civics, and she's making sure that these kiddos know why voting matters. She's getting them, she's talking about how government works. She's got a lot of volunteers who do it. She's registering kids. We're taking pre-registration cards that will send them the registration once they turn 18, or if they are afraid that they can't do that and they have to ask their parents. And so I think we actually need a lot more of that. I was just going to say, and I know that wasn't exactly about running for office, but the first thing we need to do is get young people completely engaged in the political system and in the governmental system. We just recently did focus groups with young people, and when they don't vote, and by the way, it doesn't matter where they go to school, it doesn't matter their race, it doesn't matter their gender or identity, it doesn't matter their income level. If they vote, it's because an adult has mentored them in the act of voting, because it's so confusing. And so we all can play a role in making sure that young people, and especially young women, understand that their voice matters and that they need to participate.
I've always been kind of disappointed that they moved the voting, voting places out of schools. Because when I was growing up, I know it was 100 years ago, but when I was growing up, that really made an impression on me, that people waited in line for hours sometimes just to vote. And kids don't see that anymore. And the thought that they've eliminated civics classes, what's school for, if not for civics? I just don't understand it. Hi.
Hi, Marion Harris. A quick question. I would love to hear your take on the federal discourse about what used to be the soccer mom and then the suburban housewife and now suburban women. I think they've at least gone along that far. But what your take is on that emphasis on how the importance of that particular cohort of women is in a federal election.
Well, first off, so Marion Harris is a former legislator, so thank you, Marion. I would just say this. I think more than ever we're seeing that people are frustrated with the system, right? People don't feel like those in Washington and those in the State House truly reflect their values. And women especially are feeling that frustration. So it's not my job. The great thing is I work for all voters. It doesn't matter how they vote. So I can't think about how each party is trying to get the suburban women, but I can say this, that is a reflection of a frustration. And one way to handle that is to not be engaged. The other way is to say that democracy is a participatory sport and be in there and doing everything you can.
And I think, again, using my historical thinking skills, being critical of when a group gets smushed together in a way that also is probably not representative of who women are in general, and what is a soccer mom, what is that code for? So those are also the things, I think, to be careful of what that means, who it includes, who it doesn't include, and what it assumes. Many of us are probably working parents, aging parents. It's just life is so complicated. People are complicated, and I think that's what history teaches us. And so I just ask us to be suspicious and critical of those kinds of terminology.
Yeah. I would echo that as well, both of my colleagues here, and saying I bet you if we asked what suburban means even among us, we might have different articulations of that and what that experience is and who that's signing to, who that's intended to signal to. And I think we have to be critical and aware, but also any kind of large lumping like that usually misses the nuance, usually misses the intersections that exist within there. So someone can be suburban and be poor. Someone can be in the suburbs and be wealthy. The racial identification, sexual orientation, how disability impacts that. There's so many vectors within that group. And I think it's important to, when we hear those discourses, to be critical, to be like, well, who do you mean exactly? Who are we trying to tap into? And what issues are we attempting to tap into? Because it's also signaling not just an identity group, but certain issues, certain concerns that they think might be best subsumed under this flat moniker. And so I think it's the responsibility of us to say, what are the issues we are putting forward, and how are different groups, different people impacted by those issues? How are different people affected by the environment? How are different people affected by voting rights, right? The lack of access to, et cetera. And we have to be intentional in terms of our approach to that. Because if we're not intentional, it's really easy to become exclusive. We often say the personal is political. It's not just your personal that's political. All of us have personal lived experiences that matter in terms of our political future.
It's been a privilege talking about this topic with our esteemed panelists. Thank you so much, and thanks for your attention. Appreciate it.
Well, I hope you enjoyed today's forum, and as we prepare to depart, I just would hope that to challenge you on something. As you talked about democracy as a participatory sport, think about the rights that are important to you and how much more we can accomplish when we come together. Remember, harmonies are created when people who sing contrasting parts come together to make beautiful music. And let's see how we can do more when we come together than when we try to be soloists. Okay, so. Let us thank our sponsors and partners, Otterbein University, the League of Women Voters of Metropolitan Columbus, and the Ohio History Connection, as well as our speakers, Megan Wood, Jen Miller, Dr. Treva Lindsay, and Ann Fisher. And a special thanks to all of you, and we look forward to seeing you next week at that forum.